Okay, thanks. Um, and due to the large attendance, we're requesting that you please put your questions in the chat. We do have a facilitator, Sydney Clays, that will review and share those questions during the question and answer period, which is going to be after all the presentations have concluded. And we'll do that as time allows. And so now that we're recording and folks are here, welcome. Thank you very much. This is an online information session for the Rhode Island Shellfish Restoration and Enhancement Plan. We're considering this our virtual kickoff event. And one other thing to mention about the chat, if you're either new to Zoom or having trouble finding the chat, if you look down in your toolbar, there should be a button for the chat, and when you click on it, it'll pop up something like this. So that's where you can put your questions. And I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Connor McManus to give us a brief welcome.
Thanks, Eric. I don't want to take too much time tonight because I want to leave it to the experts leading the discussions here. But I wanted to just first say thank you to Eric, John, Mike, and Sydney for helping tonight get this Shellfish Restoration Enhancement Plan off the ground running, but really particularly to all of the attendees, and thank you for hopping on tonight and providing your feedback both early here as well as we embark on the next few weeks of some of these scoping discussions. And I want to just emphasize that through this process, the real goal from my perspective is trying to best understand your perspectives and interests as we look at the ecosystem and how shellfish restoration and enhancement plays in or feeds into that. So again, I'm looking forward to your feedback through this process, and I greatly appreciate your time contributing to that. And I look forward to hearing from you all as part of it. So with that, I'll pass it back to Eric to get us started.
Thank you, Connor. Just to give everyone a brief rundown, there's going to be a series of presentations. I'm going to start with the first one. My goal is to give you an overview of the planning process we're going to use to develop the Shellfish Restoration and Enhancement Plan. Then Dr. Jonathan Grabowski is going to give a brief presentation on ecosystem services of shellfish. Mike Scuja from Pew is going to give a couple of slides about some of the lessons learned from the New York initiative. I'm going to then kind of pull it back, talk about where do we go from here, our next steps. And then Sydney Clays is going to conclude with giving us a brief tour of the website and then facilitating the question and answers as time permits. So with that, you know where you are. I just want to take a minute to acknowledge, the co-authors on this talk, and really the folks that have been kind of helping me immensely in representing what we've considered so far as really our kind of core team or our core coordination team. And those folks, in addition to support from some other entities and partners on this slide, they've really gotten us to where we are today. And I'm really excited to share that with you. And as we move forwards, we know there's a lot of partners that are interested in joining and assisting. And so, we welcome them. And we hope that there's more folks that are going to be able to join us and participate in this. But we've come this far, and now it's really at the point where we share it with you all. And, hopefully together we can all work to move this forwards and develop this plan. So I'm going to start with just a couple of kind of housekeeping things and definitions. And to orient you, at the top of my screen, you can see that I have a little bar running here. These correlate to the talks at the high end that I spoke to before, but I'll give some background. I'll then kind of get into the core of the SREP kind of planning approach and process. And you can just keep track of where we are up there. But to begin, this is a shellfish restoration plan. And so just very briefly, we're considering, focusing on our kind of 4 primary, most popular shellfish species: quahog, eastern oyster, Atlantic bay scallop, soft-shelled clam. But, if there is interest, we can certainly add additional species. they can be considered as needed. You'll hear me talk about ecosystem services. And like I said, Dr. Jonathan Grabowski is going to give a brief talk on them, but until we get to that point, you can think of them as benefits to humans from shellfish resources. The figure below gives you a little schematic of what some of those services are, but it is it is an important way to think about all of the benefits that we derive from shellfish. And then you'll also hear me talk about stakeholders. So if you are on this webinar, you are probably a stakeholder. We're considering a stakeholder as any individual or entity with a vested interest in shellfish resources or the ecosystem services they provide. And the word cloud below captures, some of the folks and entities that we've considered stakeholders. So to take a step back for just a minute, I think we're all familiar that estuaries in Rhode Island, the coastal lagoons, are dynamic and important ecological systems. They contain salt marshes, seagrass meadows, and molluscan shellfish beds that provide critical habitat for marine resources. And these habitats are also vulnerable to impacts from humans that can diminish the biodiversity and reduce ecosystem functions and services. And so considering that many habitats have incurred extensive losses, a combination of conservation approaches, including management, as well as habitat restoration and enhancement approaches, are often necessary to restore ecosystem functions and recover lost ecosystem services. Shellfish in particular historically have been and continue to be both culturally and economically important to Rhode Island. At present, several shellfish species have poor population status that can be bay scallop, eastern oyster, and soft-shelled clam. And restoration and enhancement approaches can be used to increase or restore those population statuses, as well as increase ecosystem services and improve the sustainability and resiliency of these resources to stressors such as climate change. And I'll just take a moment, if you all can just try to make sure you stay muted. Every now and then we get a little background noise. And if I can see it, I can try to mute it, but if you can give me a hand, I appreciate it. Thanks. So as I'm sure you all know, Rhode Island DEM's Division of Marine Fisheries is responsible for the conservation, the management, the restoration, the enhancement of public trust marine resources. And thus all of the restoration and activities related to shellfish must be conducted in partnership with Rhode Island DMF. And really because of this charge, we're leading the shellfish restoration planning process. However, that is not without a lot of support and collaboration with our partners. So over, numerous shellfish restoration has been conducted in Rhode Island via these partnerships. Many of them are shown in this, in the logos to the right. Most of these have been small scale, single species focused with qualitative goals and targets. And collectively through these projects, we have improved our knowledge and practices, as well as identified some challenges related to the ecological and social information that we've used to guide this work. For example, on the ecological side, site selection and site suitability still or continue to be a really important aspect, and in some cases, perhaps the most important aspect in determining the potential success of a given restoration project. We've also learned and continue to be challenged with low recruitment and in some cases, long-term sustainability from these restoration projects. On the social side, we've also identified some challenges. And taking a step back, the process that we've used to kind of scope, propose, and permit a restoration project has largely been top-down, meaning that Partners have worked together, leveraging largely ecological and management information to design a project to address a specific need. And although we reach out to as many stakeholders as we can, still can't reach that broad stakeholder engagement until later in the process, essentially until the proposal is mostly complete. And then, as many of you know, we would submit it and send it out through a public notice process. And we've learned through that um, there are definitely some shortcomings, and stakeholders have suggested to us at times in the past that they felt frustration with being involved later in the process, that they felt that this reduced their ability to provide meaningful input and share their local knowledge in this process because of when they were engaged. Folks certainly have expressed concerns with conflicts of use, and at times have offered different restoration priorities and questioned why we were proposing a specific project, given that they had valued, um, a different species or a different approach. And so, due to these shortcomings, it's recognized that Rhode Island needs a cohesive, overarching plan for shellfish restoration and enhancement activities, one that really reflects the needs of both stakeholders and managers, one that addresses the ecological and social complexities of shellfish restoration and improves outreach and engagement. And when evaluating the best planning approach, we should recognize that a number of conservation planning frameworks have stressed the importance of incorporating social considerations into the process, and ideally embracing a social ecological system approach when appropriate. And it's also important, as part of the process, to recognize and incorporate the complexity of the social, political, ecological, and economic factors that contribute to the system. In addition, it's important to provide meaningful stakeholder input early in the process to establish restoration goals and targets based on desired ecosystem services. And in many cases, you simply can't take a given approach off the shelf. An approach must still be tailored to the idiosyncrasies of your targeted system. And so you've heard me reference a social ecological system. For now, I'll have you kind of ignore that figure on the right. I'll get there in a minute just to walk you through an example. But in their simplest form, social ecological systems are comprised of interdependent components where actions by humans can both interact with other components to affect outcomes, as well as in turn be affected through feedback loops. And given the complexity of these systems, frameworks are often used to identify and organize system elements and processes, as well as conceptualize the relationships between them. And so now, to try to illustrate this, I'll use the figure on the right. This is a figure depicting the social ecological systems framework. I've adapted it from McGinnis and Ostrom, but it's based on some of Eleanor Ostrom's earlier work. And we'll step through this using an example. So I think we could all envision shellfish harvesting. So if you envision shellfish harvesting in this red box, we're going to walk through the components that can contribute to harvesting of shellfish. On this left-hand side, you have your ecological components. They're in green. They consist of recent resource systems. So you could think of Greenwich Bay or any given place. You can think of the specific species. We could use quahog. You can think of some of the government systems that kind of set the conditions that harvest occurs under. Those could be regulations, whether they're DMF possession limits or water quality regulations. And then you can think of the individuals that participate in that activities. They could be recreational shellfishers, commercial shellfishers, but all of these contribute to, in this example, shellfish harvesting. And all of those factors and components interact in a way. And so you can start to step through it and say, okay, there's a certain number of individuals, and as they harvest shellfish, perhaps shellfish is reduced. That could have a feedback to the resource system. That in turn could cause feedback to a government system. Depending on how much, they might need to change a regulation. And in response to a regulatory change, participants might change the way in which they participate. And I know that's an extremely simple simple example, but it's just meant to illustrate one, how complex and how connected these are, and how subtle changes in really any of the components can feed back to all of the components together. And so we're using a social ecological systems approach to guide the planning process. And our planning process, as we've developed it so far, contains 4 primary components. You'll see this figure in the bottom modify as I step through them. I'm going to step through these briefly, each one at a time. Right now we're in the first stage of develop the planning process, but you can see that the information collection overlaps with that. While we've been developing, we've also been collecting a lot of information. And after we collect that information, we can analyze it, develop a draft plan, get feedback, and finalize that plan. And I want to emphasize that this is not a management plan. We're developing essentially a restoration plan, a guidance document. Once this is done and completed, and we start to implement some of the recommendations, many of those will move through a management process. But what we're enacting right now is not a management process. We're following a different process than what many of you are probably familiar with. And so this first step was developing the planning process. And here we're proposing to use a participatory planning process. And this is one where stakeholders co-develop priorities and goals, meaning that all of you, hopefully on this webinar, as well as many other stakeholders, will work together to help us develop priorities and goals. We're also looking for stakeholders to provide local knowledge and insight on resources, uses, and challenges. And overall, this process is designed so that we can provide meaningful opportunities for stakeholder contributions, especially early in the process, that we can leverage partnerships and local knowledge and expertise, as well as build trust, social capital, and motivation among our participants. And so now we're going to move into the first half of this information collection and analysis. Like I said, DMF and partners have been collecting information. The figure on the right shows that there's kind of 2 bins of information you can think of as collecting, kind of the ecological information and the social information. There's a lot of existing information that we're already plan to leverage. Some of that is our fisheries independent or dependent data, water quality data, information on human uses and regulatory processes. But we've also been collecting new information. Some information is going to inform an oyster habitat suitability index model to help give us insight as to some of the most suitable locations for oyster. Recently, there was a bay scallop habitat suitability index model published. This is new information that we can leverage. We're also going to collect new information from stakeholders to help develop priorities and goals. That's shown in this symbol, and that's something I'm going to circle back to in a few minutes. Once we have our data collected and we've engaged stakeholders and we've gotten feedback, we can begin to develop draft, spatially specific restoration and enhancement goals. And for each of those goals, we can start to identify potential restoration and enhancement options. And using this information in this approach, we can start to evaluate the trade-offs between these different options. And rather than go into detail, I'll just give you an illustration again of what that might look like. Once we've completed, this analysis, we can try to summarize this being spatially specific goals, the objectives, and the trade-offs in this draft plan. We can share this with stakeholders. You guys, we can all work together to evaluate it, provide feedback, and if needed, we can update some of the analysis in the document. And on the right, I've just given you an example. It's the cartoonish example of, for a given restoration goal, we can evaluate, let's say, 2 different objectives. We can look at a number of those different variables for that objective. We could look at how suitable is that location. Are there conflicts of use? a number of different values. We can score those, and ideally what we'd like to do is have this all documented so that we can go back and, really identify it after the fact, and make decisions about what may be the best approaches and opportunities to move forwards and implement. So once the plan has completed the review, it can be published online, it can be finalized. And like I said, this is not a management process, but once it's done, implementation activities may begin to trigger a management process. We also envision this as a living document, and it will be updated with new information as that becomes available. So I'm just going to circle back briefly to the stakeholder priorities and goals. And part of the announcement, you saw that we're preparing to hold 3 in-person stakeholder meetings. These are facilitated small group meetings. Stakeholders, stakeholders that attend are going to be able to share their knowledge and perspectives to help develop draft restoration priorities and goals based on ecosystem services. And the objectives of these workshops are to define and rank the restoration and enhancement priorities and goals for the workshop's region, to describe any knowledge or information that you think could help address these goals, especially if it's information you don't believe or aware of or have not captured, as well as just provide feedback on the planning process. So like I said, there are 3 workshops. We've broken them up spatially. The first workshop will focus on areas from Watch Hill to the Narrow River. The second workshop focuses largely on the West Passage all the way up to Seekonk, and the third in the East Passage in the Sakonnet River. We'll update the information on our website probably by Tuesday. We'll have updated information on all 3 of these. And this is a chance for me to transition over to Dr. John Grabowski, who's going to speak a little bit more about ecosystem services.
All right, thank you, Eric. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, hopefully you're able to see
Yep.
my, okay.
It looks
So,
great, thanks.
Sure, thank you, Eric, for confirming that. So shellfish habitats have long been valued by coastal communities as food. I mean, this goes back millennia. And yet we've also come to realize over the last couple of decades or maybe half century, just how important these habitats are for the many different services they provide, the ecosystem services that are so valuable. For example, shellfish habitats like mussel beds and oyster reefs are really good space for fish and mobile crustaceans, many of which are species that either feed recreationally and commercially valuable species or grow up to become them. And so, the whole idea of no wetlands, no seafood, certainly shellfish fits into that category. Oysters and mussels are also, and other shellfish are really valued for removing excess nitrogen from estuaries. I'm sorry to show a nitrogen cycle here, but what's important is that, as we're all well aware, unfortunately, estuaries have often been a dumping ground for excess nutrients through farm runoff and other sources of nitrogen and phosphorus. And oyster reefs can promote denitrification, which is a process that actually takes excess nitrogen out of the system by converting it into N2 gas. And often this is happening either on the surfaces of the shells or in the sediments surrounding a reef. Well, one of the themes in coastal communities worldwide is just the conversion of natural habitats to built ecosystems. And that's certainly been a challenge for shellfish habitat that's also suffered from historic overharvesting. We're now at a point where all estuarine habitats are that are valued as essential fish habitat and for other services are in peril. But oyster reefs and I would suspect mussels as well are among the most threatened, given their historic value, not only as a harvestable species, but also often dealing with diseases and other challenges, so that have made rebuilding them really tough. And one of the major consequences of degrading that habitat is to reduce habitat complexity. We tend to go from these structured habitats that have lots of nooks and crannies, and you can imagine crabs and juvenile fish might hide, and shrimp might hide in amongst them, to less complex bottom habitats like the mudflat you see here. And of course, the consequence of this habitat degradation is the loss of the valuable ecosystem services that oysters, by filtering the water, can enhance submerged aquatic vegetation or eelgrass beds that can also stabilize other habitats like the salt marsh you see in the middle. And of course, we value them for the fish that are caught by recreational and commercial anglers. But when you destroy this habitat, you lose many of these services. We actually see we see a lot of the productivity move from the benthos, or the bottom of the estuary, up into the water column. It can become really cloudy, and actually good habitat for jellyfish and ctenophores and other things that aren't that fun to have in your estuary. And that's why there's been such a focus on restoring those coastal habitats. All right, that's all I have. I'll turn it back to you, Eric.
Great, thanks, John. Okay, now I'm going to pivot to Mike and give Mike an opportunity to let us, gain a little insight from his experiences in New York.
Great, thank you, Eric. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. If not, please raise a hand. So, thank you. Thanks, John. So my name is Mike Scuia. I am a manager with the Pew Charitable Trust in their Conserving Marine Life in the U.S. program. So Pew has had the benefit of working on this regional collaborative process and shellfish planning, either at like the estuary level or the state level, in a bunch of different places, which has been really interesting. We've worked in Florida, North Carolina, up towards you all in Connecticut. And my direct experience comes from New York. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the lessons learned for that process. I've been involved for about 1.5 years. And it's a big process. I mean, we have like close to 100 stakeholders engaged, which has been really interesting. One of the things that we found the most beneficial is actually taking time to really coalesce the vision, like what do we want to get out of this process? And so in particular, I'm excited for the work that Eric is starting here, because number one, the socio-ecological systems approach he's taking for us is essentially like a participatory approach to stakeholder engagement. So how do you like ground and center community in the process and incorporate their vision? So that's something that I think is critical and has proven critical in other states. As well as agency buy-in. So the fact that Eric is at DEM is obviously critical and key for us. When we were in New York, having DEC involved from the onset, and as we got going with like our council and our various working groups, the steering committee, having the agency engaged is very key. So I think taking the time, we had a series of 3 vision workshops with all these stakeholders, I think really helps for buy-in. Often I think people assume they're on the same page and they may not be. So conflict is to be expected. If you have a welcoming and inclusive process, that helps to fulfill a lot of the needs. If you can go one more slide ahead. So also, who is missing at the table? How do we engage them? What barriers are they facing that you are not? I think obviously bringing this hand in hand with industry and really understanding their perspective is key, but also the diversity of stakeholders that you have from various parts of the coast to the city are key in this process too. On my other slide too, I had working group fatigue too. So I think like really being cognizant of people's time. We're really grateful that you all are here, during the night and, looking forward to engage in this process, but making sure really that we have a clear remit for like, what are we trying to accomplish? Who's at the table? What is their skin in the game? What is the future and the vision that they want to see? How will the world be different from engaging in this process? I think is all pretty critical. So I think we're still on time, so I'll hand it back to you, Eric. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mike. It's really helpful. So I'm going to wrap it up with just some next steps. And so briefly, I've broken these down to kind of our core team, our implementation team. And so, for our partners, we're looking to fully engage kind of our expanded team of partners. We haven't had an opportunity to do that, but, following this, we will work out, look to expand our coordination team, define working groups. Much of that will leverage existing working groups, but we may need some new working groups. We will likely need to develop a communications team and a strategy. We'll also look to refine the planning process and certainly identify if there's any needs or challenges that we see, and as a group try to identify solutions to those. And like with most of these initiatives, we'll certainly continue to explore funding opportunities to help support it. On the stakeholder side, I do have a little bit of homework for you. It's nothing hard. Hopefully it's fun. Excuse me. And I'm just asking that you try to prepare for these in-person workshops by thinking about, what is your vision for shellfish restoration? In particular, what ecosystem services do you value? What areas are most important to you? And overall, really think about trying to convey what you want. So tell us what you want, not what you expect to get. I think so often, in part, either because of our professional training or just our, experiences, we often resort to, what we think we might expect. When we encounter a proposal or a project, we leverage that knowledge and think about things that may not work or things that are challenging about that. And this is really the chance, to get such a really robust group of stakeholders with different knowledge and experiences together to think about these kind of higher level visions or goals. There may be, new approaches that any one of us individually or even in our groups have not considered or explored. So I just leave you with that, and that's one reason why we haven't, started by offering up a bunch of maps and information. We want to really kind of start this clean and have you all think about, focusing on what you want. And just know that these meetings are open and inclusive, and that all participants will be respectful of the values and suggestions offered by everyone. And the other bit of homework here is I just request you visit our website. You sign up for our listserv just so we can, make sure that you receive all the notices. We're requesting that you register for the in-person workshops, and that's just so we can get a head count to make sure that we have enough co-facilitators and the supplies we need to make the workshop a success. And then just to give you a heads up that, stay tuned. Sometime in like late April or May, there will also be an online survey. And it would be great if we could have our stakeholders complete that as well. And so thank you very much for attending. We will have time for a few questions in the chat, I think, but before we get there, I want to turn it over to Sydney, and she's going to give us a quick tour of the website, just to orient you all.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sydney Clays, and I've been helping Eric with the Rhode Island SREP website. So I'm going to share my screen and give you a quick tour. So I hope everyone's able to see this.
Yes, it looks great.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so when you land on the website for the Rhode Island Shellfish Restoration Enhancement Plan, this is what you're first going to see. And it's kind of just an overview, of course. So this website is live right now. So at the end of this meeting, after, if you want to go on and check it out and explore for yourself, by all means, it's live and it's up. So it's a tool for you to kind of get situated with the plan and really explore the website and see what's going on. So we tried to make this as friendly as possible. Again, this is the home page. You can click on this button and that will send you to our Get Involved page. And during this tour, I'm going to really highlight where you can sign up. So at the bottom of the home page, you can sign up for our updates and future events, and this will send you and sign you up for our listserv. So I'm gonna skip right over to the SREP process. So as you can see on the top right-hand corner, you can see we have our homepage, benefits of Shellfish, the SREP process, our get involved page, our partner information, and our contact us. So right now I'm on the SREP process, and it has more information about the participatory planning process, and then also each phase and kind of what's involved with each phase. And again, at the bottom of this page, there's another sign up for our listserv. So if you want to get involved, you can go to our Get Involved page where you can click Support the SREP. And again, another sign up for our listserv, and then also hopefully the online stakeholder survey that will be coming soon. So that will also be up for you to take and fill out. And then you can also look at past events and upcoming events. And if you just want to look at events, you can go to attend an event. So here are all our events. You can see the SREP kickoff event, which is right now, our first in-person meeting, second and third. And when you click on the first in-person meeting, it'll bring you to here, and you can click on registration, and that will send you to a Google form to fill out, and then you'll be all registered to come and be involved with the first in-person meeting. Same with the second in-person meeting and the third in-person meeting. And then you can look at all the partner information as well. So we have all our partners here. It keeps scrolling if you can scroll down. And then there's also at the bottom of this page, if you want to learn more, there's more resources. There's linked to reputable sites and reputable papers on restoration enhancement plans and also on ecosystem benefits. And then the last page is contact us. So this page is really if you have specific questions for Eric and the team about the SREP. And that's kind of the whole rundown of the website. So this is also very friendly, not only on your computer, but also on your phone. So right now you're looking at the phone view. So this is what it would look like on your phone. And then you just click up on the, again, the top right-hand corner, and you'll see that nice, lovely navigation bar, and you can scroll through on your phone as well. So that concludes my part of the presentation. I hope you go to our website and check it out. We tried to make it as user-friendly and as possible. So thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. That was great. And so that concludes our presentation portion. And so I'm happy to, answer any questions. And Sydney has kindly offered to help facilitate that portion.
Yeah. So our first question is from Pete D. He says, does this plan build off the Shellfish management plan? That was a fairly substantial effort, wondering about status / accomplishments, or is this plan something different?
Yeah, great question. It does build off the Shellfish management plan. And in part, one of the recommendations of that plan was to develop a restoration and enhancement plan. So we're not going to redo that. And we're really fortunate, there's a ton of information there that we can leverage and simply reference. So we don't need to recreate those chapters. We can definitely build off it.
So the next question is from Chris. Do you have a separate listserv, or is the same listserv we get our DEM commercial fishing announcements on? This will be a different listserv. This will be completely different from the DEM listserv.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in and build on that. Thanks, Sydney. So we will continue to send these out on at least the meeting notices on the Division of Marine Fisheries listserv. But there may be, folks that don't want to, join that listserv. This might be an alternative for them. If you sign up for both, you will probably get duplicative emails. So that will be up to you. If you receive these meeting notices on that initial email, you don't need to sign up for both, but there may be in the future specific notices related to the Shellfish restoration enhancement plan that don't need to go out to the entire listserv. So I guess, I know folks don't like to be on a million listservs and get, redundant emails, but if you are really interested in participating, I would say at first, I would encourage you to sign up for this listserv. And because it's still, the process is still young, we'll see. If it becomes redundant, we can always remove you.
So Jim just had a comment. It was very nice. He said, thank you, Eric, Connor, and DMF staff to this SREP kickoff meeting. The Rhode Island Shell Fishermen's Association will be participating in this process, and we look forward to collaborating with DMF in developing the SREP. So that was from Jim Boyd. And then Katie says, I like that you're using the SESF to ground the project in theory. Or methodologies are you using to recruit stakeholder participants for the workshops and online survey?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're trying to leverage, existing listservs to get our meeting notices out. In part, trying to get folks, optimistic that folks would both attend this in person and then maybe tell some of their colleagues or friends about this process and direct them to the website. So some of it's, a little bit of a, just person-to-person communication. But you bring up a good point. I think we don't have a standing communications team, but we should probably explore some other alternatives of trying to get that message out. So if you have specific suggestions, Katie, please, by all means, shoot me an email.
Are there any more questions? So Phil says, can you briefly describe the format of the upcoming in-person workshop or workshops?
Yeah, I definitely can take a stab at that, Phil. But first I'll offer it to Mike, because these are professionally facilitated workshops. Mike, have you recently attended one? And if not, I can give a description.
Sure. So we do have a professional facilitator for this workshop, different than the ones that we had in New York, but he's great. He's from Rhode Island, but he lives in DC. But what really impressed us is just his ability to kind of structure and think about these workshops. I know that he's going to be our lead facilitator. Will be talking a bit in the beginning. Eric is going to give another brief overview of like why we're here, and then he really is going to focus on a lot of breakout groups. So getting folks from different walks of life together, probably depending on how many people we have there. I mean, we might have 50, we might have 20, but breaking up into probably 4 or 5 different groups to go through a bunch of targeted questions to kind of hone in on like why people value these shellfish resources and what they want to see from the vision. And then from there, we would come back as a wider group to discuss.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And I'll just add, in many of these small group meeting settings, we often have folks work together. Sometimes we go up to a board and try to rank things. But we're not looking for folks to sit in an auditorium and have to stand up and make, offer, opinions or comments. This will be a kind of smaller group setting. And the benefit here is that we're trying, like Mike said, to get a little bit of interaction between different user groups, and just share knowledge and share information.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that process too is like, obviously it's great to have lots of ideas generated. One of the challenges we always face with working in groups too is having like a dominant personality or someone who's taking like too much time. So as the facilitator, and I think folks in the breakout groups, we always try to get like equal representation of time and perspectives from like a variety of people.
So Liz has a question. She says, what's the difference between commercial aquaculture versus restoration of shellfish stocks? Would commercial outcompete natural restoration if co-located?
Could you just, I'm sorry, I didn't see the question. Could you just repeat the last sentence, Sydney?
Yep. So the last question would commercial outcompete natural restoration if co-located. So if they're in the same location.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple ways I could interpret that, you know, from like a ecosystem standpoint, you know, competition between competition for resources from aquaculture and restoration. I think there's a lot of variables there. Typically, as a rule, restoration and aquaculture don't occur in the same footprint, and there's a number of reasons why that is. One is from the aquaculture permitting process, that there a participant is essentially allocated, you know, a specific lease of you know, sub-bottom, and so that is theirs to use for commercial aquaculture. Whereas restoration, you know, you could think of it as a similar approach. You know, sometimes it can be a management designation, sometimes there can be an ascent associated with it, but it is a different type of spatial allocation. And it, you know, to date, and I don't envision that would change moving forward, so that's not for commercial, you know, commercial applications. It's strictly for restoration or enhancement of a marine resource. And if I didn't interpret your question correctly, just let me know and I'll try to clarify it.
Are there any further questions?
Okay, if you don't see any more questions, Sydney, you know, really on behalf of DMF, you know, all of our partners, I really appreciate you all taking the time out of your night to join us and learn more about this. Again, like Sydney said, please, you know, check out the website, at least at first, sign up for our listserv. And, you know, I hope you do consider attending some of the in-person meetings, and please tell, you know, colleagues, friends, neighbors, anyone that you think would add value to this process. With that, I hope you all have a nice evening. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric and Sydney.